Hello. They say you can never truly know anyone. You can never know what goes on inside someone else's mind. The kind of horrors that hide behind their eyes. The kind of beasts that lurk in their souls. Nothing embodies this idea quite like the werewolf. You know what a werewolf is. It's exactly what it says on the tin. Wer, the old English word for man, and wolf, the old English word for big angry dog. Man, wolf, a man who turns into a wolf. That's all something has to be to make it a werewolf. They're one of the oldest ideas within storytelling, so much so in fact that technically the first werewolf ever mentioned was in the 6th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest recorded story known to man, where, while rebuffing the resident thought of the gods, Ishtar, Gilgamesh brings up the fates of her past lovers, one of which being a shepherd that Ishtar for some reason or another decided to turn into a wolf so he may be hunted by his own employees and guard dogs. So all the way back in ancient Mesopotamia, people were telling tales of men shapeshifting into beasts, and this is a common thread across the globe, which does make sense. I mean, it's not exactly that hard to conceptualise some cunt getting too into his persona. But just because an idea is unoriginal doesn't mean it can't be flavoured into something new. From the snowy forests of Scandinavia to the bayous of Louisiana, from the Benandanti of Friuli to the country villages of Ireland, there's plenty to be heard when speaking about the werewolf. That is the glory of storytelling, the interpretations and new perspectives. And with Lycanthropes, there are millennia of those interpretations and a world of those perspectives. A few too many for one little video. So when it comes to some of the more interesting ideas, I'll let them speak for themselves in their own videos to come. For this video, I'm going to give you the basics and a tipple of history. Then, weary traveller, it's up to you to find more. Like a bitchy stepsister, I'm going to get you just excited enough to give you blue balls and tell you to fuck off and satisfy yourself. So we know that werewolves have been part of our culture for quite literally all of human history. I mean, the generic villain from our fairy tales was a big bad wolf, but why is that? Nowadays, the idea of wolves has kind of lost its kick. This isn't exclusive, of course. Nature as a whole, at least in the first world, has been kind of made our bitch, with only the weather being a real threat. But throughout most of history, wolves have been some of the most feared and hated creatures that God put beside us, so much so that on several occasions people fought essentially wars against them in an attempt to wipe them out entirely. I do enjoy the poetry of man's worst enemy burning our best friend, though. I like the irony in it. And it's the hatred and fear of these animals, combined with the very Christian hatred and fear of witches, that gives us the most well-known ideas of the werewolf. The majority of hatred for Canis lupus comes from them killing livestock and fucking up medieval economies. I don't exactly blame the pups, though. I mean, why chase a rabbit through the woods when there's a big fat juicy cow in a field that it literally cannot leave? But it wasn't only cattle that found grisly ends between the fangs of Fenrir's fraternity. An area of extensive victimization from these magnificent creatures is France, and other reasons like wolves. One of the most famous cases of this being what some attribute to be the first international media sensation, the Beast of Gévaudan. Between 1764 and 1767, over 100 people were killed by a beast that roamed the woodland, described by one of his victims as like a wolf but not a wolf. Truly a miracle that such a masterful wordsmith managed to survive their ordeal to deliver that poetry. Now testimony kind of sticks with you, doesn't it? Like a wolf, but not a wolf. It's a description that's almost familiar. That's right, some people of the time proclaimed this animal to be a loup-garou, a werewolf, an idea supported by the fact it didn't seem to kill solely for food, some of his victims being torn limb from limb and decapitated, as if the beast was angry. So, was the Beast of Gévaudan a werewolf? Maybe. Was it a lion wearing armour, being controlled by a rich guy with a fucked up arm trying to shag his sister? Also maybe. One thing we know for certain is, it's one of the two. There are no other reasonable explanations. The hysteria surrounding werewolves walking among us, watching from the shadows, was not limited to the frogs, however. In fact, it spanned all of Europe. The European werewolf trials went on long before them twats in Salem got their dicks out, and were somehow even more fucking brutal. These went on for centuries, and took place across most of the continent. Tens of thousands, if not more, people were killed after being accused of being witches or werewolves. Basically, what would happen was, much like in Salem, they'd just pick a scapegoat for all their troubles and torture them until they confessed. And while some of them were probably nonsense and murderers about it coming, most people convicted during these werewolf trials are most likely just unconforming. Undesirables, beggars, hermits, loners, non-Christians, people who were mentally ill or developmentally delayed, people who couldn't truly understand what it was they were confessing to and just wanted the pain to stop. It's some really horrible shit. And a nice reminder that the fear of monsters, more often than not, will turn the fearful into monsters themselves. Witchcraft is commonly linked to instances of werewolfery, like the shamans of the ancient Turek people or the shape changers of the Navajo. The ability is often garnered through some sort of ritual or spell, often involving wearing the skins of the animal they wish to transform into, either whole or in the form of a belt or other article of clothing. But sometimes it's done by a salve or ointment that's rubbed onto the skin. It's common for this ability to transform, like many magics, to come from some sort of deal or pact with the devil or other malevolent spirits, because of course, everything has to be demonic. This is entirely different to our modern ideas of the werewolf, that act more like a disease or an infection, transmitting their curse on through a bite. This is a modern take that you won't find in the old myths, most likely because ideas of spirituality and religion are kind of deteriorating nowadays in favour of science and other nerd shit. That's not to say the old myths didn't feature people being transformed into wolves completely out of their own control, often as a form of punishment for some wrongdoing. For example, King Lycanthrope, the man who tricked Zeus into eating human meat and was punished for this act by being transformed into a wolf. I'll get into him further when I talk about his cult in another video. But it isn't just the pagan gods who did this. The Werewolves of Ossory are people transformed by the Christian god. That seems a little bit hypocritical if you ask me, but hey, mysterious ways and all that bollocks. In some versions of the story, it's St. Patrick that curses them after they mock his teachings by howling at him, their way of saying that his preaching is no more valuable than the call of an animal. In other versions, it's another saint named Natalis, who did it over some sin that the people there have long forgotten. Either way, it's not a very saintly act, is it? The curse goes that two people from the village, usually a married couple, must transform and live as wolves for 7 years before returning to the village if they survive, wherein which the next two will begin the trial. The whole transforming for a set amount of time thing is very common with this type of werewolf. This curse idea, however, is simply a Christian transmutation of the story of the Werewolves of Ossory. See, Ireland was full of werewolf tales long before the Christians ever turned up, most likely because wolves were once very prevalent throughout the place, so much so that it was nicknamed Wolfland. Other versions of the Ossory werewolves say that it wasn't a curse at all, and in fact the folk there just kinda did that, inheriting it from old kings that once ruled the land. They would lie down and enter a death-like sleep, sending their spirits forth to roam the woods as wolves. But if their bodies were moved while in this state, they could be permanently trapped in their lupine forms. This is very similar to the Benedante of Friuli, northern Italy, known in English as the Good Walkers, who, during the Catholic Ember days, would have released their spirits into the world to go and fight evil witches and warlocks. They would fight over various foods, fruits and crops, and whatever the Benedante won would be in abundance that year. In some of the stories, their spirits would take the forms of animals, one of these animals being the wolf. Though they met a fair amount of opposition within the Inquisition, during the very same witch trials I spoke about earlier, the Benedante will claim to be fighting on behalf of the very same god as the Inquisitor interrogating them. The Benedante to me seem more like benevolent witches rather than werewolves, but I thought I'd mention them anyway because there's some very similar groups that take their righteous shamanistic ideals and blend them fully with the European werewolf. In Swedish Livonia, now modern-day Estonia and Latvia, during the era of those witch trials, a rather quirky gentleman known as Thies of Kaltebon was brought in to be questioned over a church robbery he'd witnessed. Thies then went on, completely unprompted, what I assumed to be a raving rant, freely and enthusiastically proclaiming himself to be a werewolf. The court, utterly befuddled by this, asked him what he was yapping about, and Thies went on to explain that he was a hound of God. A group of other werewolves who on the nights of St. Lucy's Day, Midsummer's Day and Pentecost would don the skins of wolves to take their form and descend into hell where they would battle with witches and demons. Like the Benedante, the hounds of God would fight to retrieve the crops and livestock the satanic forces had stolen. The outcome of the fight would determine the abundance or famine that would follow in the year. It was also found by the court that Thies practiced folk magic, healing and protecting members of the community, an act they felt need to punish him for, by flogging and banishing him, because helping people out means nothing if you're not kissing their god's ass while doing so. The idea of werewolves being defenders rather than predators was actually a lot more widespread than the church would like people to believe. Heading back to Ireland, we have Lycanthrope Fela, who is also associated with the region of Ossory. He and his children had the ability to shapeshift into wolves, hence the name Fela, meaning wolf shape. Lycanthrope is said to be the ancestor of a tribe of warrior werewolves, the Faelot, where those Ossory kings I mentioned come from. These warrior werewolves would fight in wars as mercenaries for ancient kings, but they also took on the roles of guardians, protecting the most vulnerable of the village: children, women, the old, the wounded, the exact opposite of the bestial monsters we see in France, which lends more credence to my theory that the French must have had it coming. But the Irish aren't the only people who have stories of warrior werewolves. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote about an ancient Baltic or Slavic tribe which apparently would transform into wolves for part of the year. There was also the Indo-European Koyos, the practice in which boys would become men by travelling in a tribalist warband wearing animal skins such as the wolf, and through ritual transforming into those animals to hunt or fight on the battlefield. But the shape-shifting warrior I've no doubt you instantly pictured the second I said the words was the Ulfethnar, the wolfskin-wearing berserker Vikings that wielded the strength, endurance and ferocity of the wolf. In order to become an Ulfethnar, one would have to go through an initiation where they go out into the wilderness and live as their totem animal, surviving by hunting, gathering and raiding, intertwining themselves with the savageness of the world and learning what it is to be a wolf. In battle they would enter a frenzied trance which, by the stories, made them invincible, and able to be harmed by fire or iron. No silver bullets back then. Like the Irish Faelot, the Ulfethnar weren't seen as monsters, at least until the Christians turned up. These warriors were actually held in quite high regard, being given their fair share of credit for Harald Fairhair's conquering of Norway. And they're heavily favoured by the Allfather, Odin, who's credited as the one to grant the Ulfethnar their success in battle. Because Old One Eye is very ingrained with the symbol of wolves, being inevitably swallowed by the great wolf, Fenrir, son of Loki, during Ragnarok. and also having 2 wolf companions, Gary and Freki, who are most likely inspirations behind Ylfethnar. And despite the whole killing the king of the gods and setting the world on fire and eating the sun and causing the collapse of humanity thing, wolves were kind of revered in Norse culture. So much so that in Norse storytelling, if someone is described as being followed by wolves, it's actually a good omen. It means they're headed to great success in their quest and will be leaving behind the many corpses of their enemies. I've talked a lot about Europe, so let's hop across the pond, but circle back to our French theming. The United States is full of stories that have evolved from the tales carried over by the settlers that ruined the place. The werewolf is no exception. In the treacherous swamps of Louisiana, it's no tall task to find danger, but one stands out among the others. You may find yourself travelling through the bayou, keeping an eye out for alligators while returning home after a long day of whatever it is people do in swamps. When after rolling over the trees around you, your gaze comes to settle on a bone-chilling sight. 2 glowing red eyes watching you from the shroud of the descending shadows. You hear its growl rumble through the leaves, you feel its breath on the back of your neck, and before you know it, you're moving a hell of a lot faster than you were before. When you make it home, if you make it home, be sure to keep the story to yourself, lest you incur the wrath of the Rougarou. The Rougarou, as the name suggests, is another French werewolf, though this time it doesn't actually reside in France, instead being Cajun folklore after migrating down from Nova Scotia. The Cajuns, for those unfamiliar with the United States, are like the French, but somehow even more amphibious. But the Rougarou is quite different from its European brethren, having been influenced over the years by the other cultures around it, such as voodoo. The interesting thing about the Rougarou is that it's a lot more in line with our modern idea of lycanthropes. While all the werewolves spoken about thus far have transformed into actual 4-legged wolves, the Rougarou walks on 2 legs, like a man. It has the head of a wolf or a dog, a set of large fangs, and glowing red eyes. Also like the modern werewolf, some tales claim the Rougarou to be a person unwillingly suffering from a curse, haunted by insatiable hunger and thirst for blood, as well as an unquenchable rage, doomed to transform into the beast they loathe during the night until they pass the curse onward through a bite. The Rougarou acts as a cautionary tale meant to scare children into behaving, as well as staying away from the dangerous swamps. Do what you're told, the Rougarou will get you. For Catholics, the Rougarou may come for you if you fail to follow Lent, or sometimes you'll find yourself cursed to become the beast on a nightly basis for the ensuing year, which sort of plays into the whole other story from the Werewolves of Ossory. Another way to get on its hit list is to speak its name, a common theme in American folklore. If you encounter it out in the bayou, then go running your mouth, the Rougarou may feel a need to silence you. This might be because the neighbour you're speaking to is that very same monster you came across. There are ways to defend against the Rougarou, such as placing 13 objects outside your door. The silly cunt can't count above 12, so he'll be stuck there all night counting over and over again until the sun comes up, forcing him back to the shadows of the swamp. Not unlike vampires with rice. Another way is to show him his own reflection, because I guess he's a little bit insecure, so showing him his own face will cause him to run back into the bayou to go and fix his makeup or something. Whilst being a few centuries old, the Rougarou is still very much a modern legend, still being passed down from parent to child, and sightings of the monster are still reported to this day. If you find yourself a little more southward, in Brazil, you may come across a similar creature. You may be walking down a dark, lonely country crossroads, when you're suddenly hit by the most putrid fetor. Your face contorts into a grimace, and just as you re-swallow your lunch, you see it. A shadow. A creature with dark black fur, furious red eyes, long ears, and front legs shorter than the back. And now you're face to face with the Lobizarmen. The Lobizarmen is a werewolf-like creature who savagely leads them to eat just about anything, but they prefer the flesh of unbaptized babies, just like our modern-day politicians. It resembles something between a pig and a dog, though in some cases it takes on attributes of other farm animals such as donkeys, bulls, and sheep, becoming a hybrid of all of them. So technically it doesn't really fit into the category of werewolf, but considering the similarities in description to the Rougarou, I still thought it pertinent. There are a few curious ways to become a Lobizarmen. One is to be the 7th child born in a string of babies of the same gender. Another tale declares that it's a boy being born after a string of 7 girls, the boy transforming into the Lobizarmen every Friday night after his 13th birthday, but this may be avoided if he is baptized. Another, much simpler way is just inheriting the curse, it transmitting from father to son or grandfather to grandson. And in other versions, it's a product of incest. If you ever find yourself in the midst of one of these chimeric monsters, something you can tell by their sickly and tired appearances while in their human forms, know that silver is not what will help you. Instead, to kill or heal the Lobizarmen, you need a bullet coated in the wax of an altar candle that's been used for at least 3 separate Sunday masses. The Lobizarmen prowls the darkness every Friday night at midnight, transforming at a crossroads which they will return to at dawn to change back to their human forms. But during Lent, they transform every night and hunt much more aggressively and savagely. I find that aspect interesting, the crossroads. It lends more to the infernal element, since we all know who you'll like to meet there. I do think it's worth noting that there are similar things to the lobism and the rougarou found in England. South of Scarborough, near a little place called Flixton, travellers were being attacked in the night by some kind of creature. It was so much of a problem that a hostel was built for travellers to stay in during the night to keep themselves safe. The monster was described as having dark shadowy fur, abnormally large crimson eyes, a tail almost as long as its body, and an easily recognisable putrid stench. It was thought to be connected to a local magician, either by being controlled by them, or by the magician themselves shape-shifting into it. At one point the beast attacked a carriage, and one of the passengers managed to shoot the thing, but the bullet was unable to harm it. But what's most unnerving is this thing was sighted in Flixton as recent as the 70s. Cannock Chase in Staffordshire has a pigman of a similar description, but that's quite near Birmingham, so it's probably just a local. And near Hull is where you find Old Stinker, first reported in the 1700s, but sightings remain prevalent throughout the modern day. As the funny name suggests, it's another monster that can be smelled before it's seen. It also has glowing red eyes, black hair, and stands on its hind legs like a man, tall enough to emasculate anyone. So if you ever find yourself driving through Yorkshire in the middle of the night and you see 2 red lights at the side of the road, don't stop, because if you get out the car, you won't be getting back in. There are more werewolves of this type in the US too, other than the rougarou. In Wisconsin, near a place called Elkhorn, you may stumble across the monster known as the Beast of Bray Road. Standing over 7 feet tall, the beast has the face of a canine but the muscular body of a man covered in brownish grey fur, eyes that shine red when catching the glow of headlights, and a foul, rotten stench that permeates the air around it. It's known to dig up burial mounds, chase cars that stray into its territory, and has even attempted to break into a few homes. I think the most interesting part of this particular story is when Linda Godfrey, the author responsible for popularising the legend, walked into her local police station and asked if they knew anything about it. The police chief walks into the back of the department and comes back with a big thick file labelled Werewolf. These are all very similar creatures. Kinda makes me wonder, if these things can be in the US, Brazil, and in England, where else might they lurk? And with that, we find ourselves in the modern era. So, what was the first werewolf in modern fiction? Fuck if I know. I'm not a historian, I'm a fucking idiot. And really it doesn't matter. But the first werewolf I can think of off the top of my head is one I'm certain you'll recognise. Dracula. I'll explain. In Bram Stoker's original novel, as well as the 1993 film, one of the talents possessed by the titular bloodsucker was the ability to transform into a wolf, as well as control a pack of them. Something that denotes just how bestial Dracula truly is, and in fact in the lore of the book, the legend of the werewolf comes from him. But I haven't read Dracula. I considered doing it, but then I read through an entire translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh just to find out the werewolf in that is a single fucking sentence and doesn't even have a bloody name, so frankly I couldn't be fucking arsed. So instead, let me tell you why Bram Stoker chose to give his famous vampire this power. Let me tell you about the Pricklelich. Romania is chock full of vampire tales, but the Pricklelich stands out among the others for having the penchant of transforming into a wolf, thus making it half vampire, half werewolf, kinda like that one cunt Kate Beckinsale was shagging. It's said that if a man is very violent and malicious in life, he may come back as an equally vicious Pricklelich in order to continue hurting people. Another way of creating a Pricklelich is to continue breastfeeding an infant after it's already been weaned off milk, wherein which after death they will resurrect to torment their own family. So, if you have a son, don't let him be a mummy's boy, or he will turn out to be a goth furry. So, to summarise, I find that there are 3 distinct types of werewolf. The first is the most physical, often being cursed or afflicted with some kind of magic infection that can be passed from werewolf to victim, often through a bite, but sometimes through lineage. Sometimes this curse acts as a penance for upsetting a whiny god. Like I said, these are the most physical of changes, their bodies physically shifting into the monster, usually meaning that to turn back, they have to cut or tear away the skin of the wolf that entraps them. Sometimes this kind appears as the proper 4-legged animal, usually if they're cursed by some kind of deity, but more often than not, they're portrayed in the more horror-mutated humanoid way. They have dark shadowy fur, large red eyes, disproportionate limbs, and a terrible, terrible stink. And while in some cases, usually with the god curse, they keep their human minds, at least at the beginning, other times they appear to lose themselves completely to the beast. This variant is usually seen more as tragic rather than evil, the werewolf instead being a victim of circumstance and misfortune, and often cannot help themselves from becoming the beast they loathe. The second type of lycanthrope is one created through witchcraft, forming a ritual or spell to reshape their bodies into that of a wolf. These seem to almost always appear as a regular 4-legged animal. Sometimes they're larger and stronger, but it's important that they can blend in with a normal pack and hide themselves. This kind is often seen as the most evil, the ability usually coming from the devil or other evil entities and requiring an irredeemable act to gain. though in many pre-Christian cases, this type of werewolf can be seen as a noble, well-respected warrior class, protecting the vulnerable and fighting in wars as a force for good. This variety seems to keep their human wits almost entirely while in their lupine forms, though sometimes after too long as the wolf, or if they allow it to take them while in battle, their animalistic nature begins to get the better of them. Though most of the time it appears they can control themselves almost as well as they can when human. The third archetype I find are the soul projectors, people who enter a meditative trance and allow their souls to leave their bodies in the form of a wolf. This is the most spiritual variant and also the most good, usually using their ability to protect their communities and fight evil forces, dispelling curses and preventing famines. Their bodies don't physically change, simply falling asleep while their souls are out and about. But if their bodies are moved or disturbed while in this state, they may remain trapped in their wolf form, and there's no telling the toll it may take to remain in the mind of a wolf for a prolonged period. So now you know a little more about the first furries, and your life is better for it. I think werewolves might be one of my favourite folkloric entities, despite the furry community's best efforts to make them gay and cringe. And not just because I find them cool, they're just so versatile in storytelling. With the variety in how the legend works, you could fit them into just about every theme and genre, you know? In the introduction, I touched upon that it could symbolise that monsters seldom appear as such at first. But it could also be used as an allegory for what it's like to be another, to not quite fit into the world or society. It can also be used to explore ideas of identity. Am I the man, or am I the beast? It could be used as a puberty allegory in a coming-of-age story. You could put it in my favourite type of story, a man fighting against what he sees as his own nature in an attempt to change. With the pack dynamic, you can explore what it means to be a family. There's just so much to it, I fucking love it. But anyway, that's the end of the video. I mentioned a few things that deserve an in-depth look that I didn't feel like packing into this video. And whilst I do plan on making videos on them in the future, I do implore you to do some research yourself. In fact, I suggest you do some research on everything I mentioned in this video, because I left quite a few things out, and I'm not educated, so I probably got a few things wrong. If that's the case, then please correct me. I'll pin the comment or whatever the fuck it is you do on this website. So, I bid you farewell, leaving you one final thought. We all have animals inside us. It's nature, and it can be scary hearing their howls in your mind. But sometimes it's best to let that animal out to breathe every once in a while, lest it build up the strength to tear itself free.